Welcome to Grace Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Matt Pensinger. We are very excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope that you enjoy your lunch and enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Pastor Matt. Can you hear me okay? Is that better? My name is Jason Alari, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Historical Society. It's great to see everybody here. I have two quick announcements, and then we are going to introduce Judge Getty. The first announcement is a calendar announcement. Our next BLT, October 17th, we have Marianne Ashcraft. Mimi, are you here? Oh, there's Mimi. She's going to be telling Isaiah Leitner's story and interweaving some Civil War history in her BLT. Also, mark your calendars for the Society's annual meeting of the membership. That is October 31st. You do not have to wear a Halloween costume, but you can if you want to. It's going to be at the Best Western in Westminster, 11:30 to 1:30. And we are going to honor there Dr. Jim Leitner and Frank Badovic, who are receiving distinguished awards this year from the Society. We are delighted to have the Honorable Joseph M. Getty speaking today. Judge Getty retired as Chief Judge of the Supreme Court of Maryland. He was appointed to that court in 2016 by Governor Larry Hogan. Judge Getty is a former state senator and delegate representing Maryland's 5th District. In February 2015, then Senator Getty was appointed by Governor Larry Hogan to his cabinet as Legislative and Policy Director. He earned a BA in American Studies from Washington College in 1974, his MA in American Civilization from George Washington University in 1980, and his JD from the University of Maryland School of Law in 1996. He served as Executive Director of the Historical Society from 1987 to 94. He is an architectural historian and historic preservation researcher who served on the board of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Judge Getty served on the Board of Governors of Union Mills Homestead Foundation from 1979 to 1992. He served as chair of the Carroll County Committee for Maryland's 350th anniversary, member Carroll County Historic District Commission from 89 to 92, Carroll County Chamber of Commerce from 90 to 94, and delegate Republican Party National Convention in 2012. Judge Getty is the author of Uniontown, Maryland Walking Tour in 1983, Carroll's Heritage Essays on Architecture of the Piedmont, Maryland and Carroll County, 1987, and The Engine of Liberty and Uniontown Advertiser, 1993. We have copies of one of Joe Getty's publications here. They're on the table at the check-in. Be sure to check that out, and I believe they're on sale today, right, Laura? Okay. We also have copies of the Carroll History Journal. You might have seen Judge Getty's recent article in the journal, so check that out. There's copies also at the check-in. A superb researcher, one of Judge Getty's interests has been the cigar industry in Manchester. He has lectured and written a lot about this, including his recent article in the journal. And today he will share some of his research with us. Can we have a warm round of applause for Judge Getty?
Thank you. I appreciate everybody coming today and joining me in one of my research loves. Apparently, I am the world's foremost authority on Manchester cigar makers. And this is a repeat performance. I don't know how many repeat performers. You've had Jason or Lynn, but I did give a program on Manchester cigar makers in 2014, 9 years ago. I had been doing some articles freelance for the Northern News and talked about the cigar makers of Manchester. Some of you, like me, may have grown up in Manchester and heard stories all of our lives about the cigar industry. And Frank Badovic asked me, maybe pestered me, to turn those articles into a journal article, which Jason just talked about, and there'll be copies available after the presentation. And I have to thank the Publications Committee for their hard work on that journal article. There were many drafts, and it was improved greatly by the Publications Committee. Frank and Sam Brainerd did some of the census work that I'll be referencing. So today is a broader view than the journal article, Carroll History Journal. I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour. Some of the themes we'll encounter are the early entrepreneurs in the cigar industry, and many of them were young, in their mid-20s when they started a cigar factory. We'll talk about how fluid the community was, that there were lots of connections to Baltimore City and to Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania, where there were lots of farmers growing tobacco. Cigar tobacco grows better in loamy soils. We think of tobacco as being sandy soils, and that's the cigarette tobacco of southern Maryland. But the brand of cigar tobacco grew better, and it's still grown by the Amish in sort of the limestone soils of central Pennsylvania. And we'll also talk about how Manchester was dominant as in the field of cigar making in Carroll County. And it all began here, not the Manchester cigar making, but my interest in it. I was a graduate student at George Washington University. I was doing some research on Manchester. I did an interview with a family down the street, John and Ruth Riley. I was in Boy Scouts with their grandsons, so I knew them well. And they pulled this photograph out of their family collection of photographs. And it's the interior of a cigar factory in Manchester. They did not know the people. They did not know who the cigar maker was. And they assumed that some of their family members were in the photograph. And I've later determined that this is Charles Warner's cigar factory. But having an interior view from the late 1800s of any industry is really spectacular. So I knew that this was an excellent documentation of what was going on in Manchester at the time. First thing I did was I turned to Harvey Slichter's book, which is an excellent community history, although the early part of it is church history and the pastors of the congregations in Manchester. 2 centuries of grace and growth. In the later chapters is basically Harvey Slichter recording oral histories of the community in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And Harvey Slichter had several references to sort of the oral traditions that many of us heard growing up in Manchester. It was an important center, that it developed after the Civil War, provided employment for many members of the community, and the general pattern was a factory on the second floor and a retail store on the first floor. And that's what we see in this interior photograph. And one of the things about developing the cigar industry was that it didn't require a lot of capital. It didn't require heavy transport. Manchester was bypassed by the train. A lot of industry moved to Hampstead, canneries, lumber yards, that type of thing. And so somebody could create a cigar factory in Manchester, not require heavy transport. They could take their product by wagon to the Greenmount station or the Miller station. And so on the left-hand side of that interior photograph, this is sort of the production area. You can see to the far left is a press. The cigars were made by a filler tobacco wrapped in a binder leaf, and then it was put in a press to form its shape. So you have a press, you have a machine that the man is sitting at that is a chopping machine. Behind him is a man with a hopper of the filler tobacco. And so the tobacco leaves were stripped of their veins, sorted into 3 categories. Filler could be chopped up, binder, and then the best leaves were saved for the hand rolling and the finished leaf. And so on the right-hand side of the photograph, you see the women at the workstations. It was very labor-intensive, hand-rolling cigars. You see the cigar factory owner, Charles A. Warner, and on the far right-hand side, there's a table that was probably the finished product area. Now, you see these cigars were rolled and bundled into groups, and they could be then put in a hogshead barrel and shipped by barrel down to Baltimore, where they might be packed in boxes. But you might also have on the far right-hand side, if Charles Warner was producing these for his own marketing, that's where they would be boxed. So it's a great interior view that gives you a good idea of how the product was used. These are cigar molds. You can find them at flea markets. There were thousands and thousands of these used, but the women sitting at the workstations would take the filler tobacco, put it in a binder leaf, put it in a mold. The molds were then closed, stuck in the press, and they were pressed for whatever amount of time the factory owner felt would be appropriate. It could be 3 or 4 hours, it could be overnight, and then once they had taken shape, they were pulled out and then given a final wrapper leaf. Charles A. Warner, I didn't know a lot about, and I found him in the census in Baltimore City. In 1880, he was 22 years old, but listed himself as a cigar manufacturer, not a cigar maker. His father, William H. Warner, he was living at home. His father was a cigar maker, probably in a Baltimore factory. And there are several references. One is an 1896 Democratic Advocate article that referred to Charles Warner's cigar factory. So I think he never moved to Manchester. He doesn't show up on the Manchester census tracts. I think he was probably a boarder. He lived in one of the hotels during the week and went back to Baltimore by train on the weekends. But he learned the trade in Baltimore and came to Manchester because there was an opportunity for him to run his own factory. He had his factory in a house that probably Samuel Abkin had a factory in prior to that. This is the location. It had a longer wing in it at the time, and the factory was on the 2nd floor, and probably Warner had a retail operation of some type on the 1st floor. But many of the factories were in individuals' homes. Along with the interior photograph, there's an exterior photograph of the Warner factory. This is probably 1895 to 1900. And you can see a lot of women in the photograph. In the interior, the women were at the workstations doing the hand rolling, as well as many children. So it was quite a family affair. And to get back to the Rileys, after the Carroll History Journal came out, I sent copies to my friends Tommy Riley and Bobby Riley. And they sent me a piece of stationery of George W. Riley, their great-grandfather. John and Ruth did not know who in the photograph was their family members. But it was probably John's father, George W., who started his own cigar factory, but then died as a young man. He died when he was 27 years old. His son John was 3 years old, so John didn't know his father. And probably in this group photograph, George W. is one of the teenagers or young men learning the trade of the cigar making, opening his own factory a few years later, but then dying young. So that's sort of an introduction, overview of how these cigar factories were set up and laid out. To give a little bit of a national context, in working on the History Journal article referred to the Cigar History site by Tony Hyman. And it's a nice setup because what happened in Manchester followed the national pattern. Cigars became popular after the Civil War. Troops smoked cigars during the Civil War. There's a famous photograph of General Grant at his tent smoking a cigar. And so Hyman calls the period 1863 to 1877 the pre-golden age of cigar making. The period 1878 to 1915, the golden age, and this is when the cigar factories in Manchester were producing thousands and thousands of cigars. And then from 1916 to 1962, the machine age. Pennsylvania was the #1 state for the number of cigar factories. They had over 4,500 cigar factories. Maryland was number 7, and there were over 500 cigar factories in the city of Baltimore. So there's this emerging market. People are jumping into the market because there's money to be made. There was an enormous demand. And one of the early entrepreneurs was Samuel L. Lilly, a Democratic advocate of 1882, identifies 3 of the early cigar makers in Manchester. Based on their 1881 numbers, Lilly made 604,000 cigars over the year 1881. Nelson Wareheim manufactured 403,500. And Hively manufactured 103,200. So it's over 1 million cigars made in Manchester, and they paid taxes of $6,667. So it was a factory industrial process. It was regulated by the federal government, but there was lots of money involved, and if you were a factory worker, it was great wages in a Manchester factory. According to Schlichter's book, Samuel Lilly was one of the 2 earliest cigar factories. He trained in his shop many of the individual workers who either continued in the profession in Manchester in other factories or started their own factories. He's the only one to advertise in the 1877 business directory, business references in the Lake Griffin Stevenson Atlas. Samuel Lilly, manufacturer, wholesale, and retail dealer in cigars, keeps constantly on hand the largest and best stock of cigars in the county, also all the best brands of tobacco and snuff. In 1884, Lilly decided to relocate, and he went to Frederick, which was also a booming center for cigar making. They had the access of the railroad, which helped in terms of getting the raw materials and sending off the finished product. He took 10 employees from Manchester with him. Of those, many came back. Charles Masonheimer became one of the biggest factories in the Golden Age, as well as Archie Bookman. And Nelson Wareheim, who was in a different location, moved right into Lilly's location, the corner of Main and York Streets, and expanded his cigar operation. The Historical Society has an 1892 business review and directory in its library. and they give business histories that the owner of the business would purchase. Nelson Wareheim has a very nice history in the 1892 Business Review. He claimed he was the largest cigar manufacturer in Manchester with the Excelsior Cigar Factory. He began the factory in 1874. He was also running a hotel business at the time. 1888, he moved into a two-story building with retail and the factory on the second floor, just as Reverend Slichter told us. His wife, Sarah Wareheim, became the owner of the business. I presume that they perhaps faced some financial difficulties where he decided that the cigar business would be protected if Sarah, his wife, owned the business. They were producing in 1892 80,000 to 100,000 cigars per month. They shipped them to Baltimore City, and from Baltimore City they were shipped across the nation. There was also a big market as California was expanding in San Francisco and the West Coast. So a lot of the cigars from this region were shipped all the way across the country. So we have the fact of a woman-owned business about 1900 by Sarah Wareheim running the cigar factory. There's also a very fluid interaction among the population of Manchester cigar makers. I don't think they were as much competitors as they were friends and colleagues. They intermarried, the families intermarried. Good example is Nelson and Sarah Wareheim's children. Josephine married William Masonheimer, who was the foreman of the Masonheimer factory. Laura married Robert M. Shower, who had a union shop cigar factory that we'll talk about. And Harry, the son, married Bertie Hofacker. The Hofackers, mostly from Elysia, had commercial enterprises in downtown Manchester. Nelson and Sarah moved to Harrisburg in 1907, but continued to visit their children and grandchildren in Manchester. Another of the early entrepreneurs is Charles Hively. Hiveleys were an early settler in Manchester. Christian Hively had a dry goods store, probably in the first decade of Manchester's founding. Charles's father was Adam. Adam's listed in the 1850 census as a tobacconist. Not sure exactly what that means, but he may have gotten his son Charles into the trade. And so Charles is running a grocery store as well as a cigar manufacturing, and he's listed as a cigar maker in 1900 and 1910, and he's frequently referenced as one of the early entrepreneurs. Another name that comes up is William Tell Everhart. The Everhart and the Shower families were prominent in Manchester. Oliver Troxell Everhart wrote a history of the Shower and Everhart families in the late 1800s. And he, in discussing William Tell, said he received his education at the Manchester Academy, was employed in his father's store until 1876. He formed a partnership with E.S. Everhart for manufacturing cigars. April 1878, he purchased his partner's interest and continued the business until 1879. So you can see not all of the cigar makers were successful. A number of local people jumped into the business, didn't require a lot of capital, but if they weren't able to earn a profit from it or turn a revenue on it, they discontinued it. And so the Everhart name comes up. There is an Everhart in Frederick in the later years, and I don't know if he's related to these Everharts or not. But not all early entrepreneurs were successful. And then Henry Sherman Musselman had an operation in the center of town. He's listed in the 1884 Maryland Directory as Musselman and Brothers. His brother was Jacob E. Musselman. This photograph is an excellent photograph of Musselman factory and staff. It's a little bit faded, but you can see Musselman to the far right-hand side, the proprietor of the factory, very proud, with his workers. As we get into the later years, there are less women working in the factories, and it becomes an all-male enterprise. But this must be Musselman's daughter standing in the doorway of the factory. Retail on the first floor, factory on the second floor, and this building is today's Dutch Corner restaurant. Always been a hotel or boarding house or restaurant at that location. So to transition from the early entrepreneurs into sort of the golden era, I pulled this one article from the American Sentinel in 1888, and it tells what was going on in the fall. Cigar factory conducted by Becker Brothers was closed last week. The stock and machinery was removed to Baltimore. Becker Brothers was an example of a Baltimore City cigar maker. Saw an opportunity for perhaps cheap labor in Manchester, moved all their equipment to Manchester, operated for about 2 years, and then decided the pastures were greener in Baltimore and moved back to Baltimore. John Miller of Tank is about to move his factory here and enter into a partnership with Henry Hofacker. I think of Tank as Tank Station along the Western Maryland Railway line near Tannery. But apparently Miller Station either generically was referenced as Tank when the locomotives came up into the Piedmont Plateau. They had to refuel with water for the steam engines. And so there was a large tank at Miller Station. John Miller is from Miller's, but it's referred to as Tank in this article. Charles Brillhart and brother are building a new factory. Hoffman and Richards are just starting a factory, and the reporter, Greenberry Everhart, provided community news to the American Sentinel. The prospect of increasing the cigar manufacturing business here is very encouraging. Sam Brainerd helped with the History Journal article and did an abstract of census facts and how many people identified themselves as working in the cigar industry. 1860, there were two. One was a John Musselman, perhaps related to Henry Musselman. 1870, there were 3. 1880, there were 19, which is sort of the early stage of the Hively and Lilly operation. Unfortunately, 1890, the census detail records are lost. But by 1900, 151 people in Manchester considered themselves primarily laborers in a cigar factory or cigar manufacturers, or some listed themselves as a cigar packer, a cigar box maker. And if you think about the total population of 609, probably a third to a half are children. So almost a half of the adults in the community are working in the cigar industry. And that continues into 1910, 1920, and then you see the decline, 1930, 1940, 1950, you get one. The golden era, I thought, could be summed up by this article, little blurb, again from the American Sentinel, probably Greenberry Everhart writing in 1911. Our cigar factories are putting in full-time, 12 hours a day from 6 to 6 to meet their orders. In conversation with the manager of Gettier, he said they are handicapped for want of hands, and their shipments are 190,000 to 400,000 cigars a month, most of which go to the Pacific Coast. The Masonheimer and Hansen factories are also in full blast with heavy shipments each month. Each week they pay more than $1,000 to their employees. So you can see what an economic boost this was to the community of Manchester. In the Historical Society collection, Mary Shellman saved an insurance tariff book from 1899, and I like to refer to it when I'm looking at community histories. And this shows the extent of the cigar factories in Manchester in 1899. Charles Warner was there. The Hofackers had two different factories, Motter on the west side of Main Street, Hoffman and Gettier. On New Street is Archie Buckman. It's not Buchanan, but it's spelled that way in the tariff book. Masonheimer, also spelled wrong, but he had a large factory on what today is called Westminster Street. And York Street had one factory by Jacob Kling. There's a 1902 United States Directory of Cigar Manufacturers. To give a reference point on Carroll County, you can see that Manchester was the leader with 7, Westminster had 4, Hampstead 3, Tawnytown 2, Harney 2, Greenmount, Snydersburg, and Millers. So if you put the northwest or northeast corner of the county together, you've got 10 in Manchester and Hampstead. You got 13 cigar makers. And the 1902 directory also gives the names of the cigar makers in Manchester at the time. And you see some of the prominent names: Brillhart, Gettier, Hansen, Hoffman, Masonheimer, Wareheim, and Clarence Dudner. I also gave for reference the other Northeast names: Esterlaw, Grogan, Crampton, Houck, and Hampstead, Miller Brothers and Millers, Snydersburg Cigar Manufacturing Company in Snydersburg, and W.E. Rupp in Greenmount. Now, Charles Brillhart was one of the early entrepreneurs. I put him in this section because he also represents the golden era. He and his brother and his sons continued a cigar operation over at least 3 decades, maybe 4 decades. In the 1892 Business Directory in the Historical Society collection, he was manufacturing 40,000 cigars with 4 full-time employees. Began his career as a school teacher and then as a merchant, started the cigar factory in 1884. He was also active in local politics and was elected treasurer of Carroll County. His brother Franklin Brillhart was the supervisor of the factory. Their brands were Louise, Happy Thought, Winter, and Old Smoker's Delight. Here's a photograph of the Brillhart family with Walter Brillhart and Robert. Walter is the child on the lap of Robert Brillhart, and those are his sons, Charles and Walter, who also worked in the factory. One of the interesting contributions to the Manchester Historical Center is the Brillhart printer's blocks. These are brass blocks. I've reversed the images because if you look at them, they're in reverse because they were printing on the top of cigar boxes. But the Manchester Historical Center has 4 of the printer's blocks of C.H. Brillhart and Son, very much Victorian era design work in them. And then I frequently get asked about whether tobacco was grown in this area. It was. It's hard to find it because I don't think it was recorded in the agricultural census. There's only about 5 acres of tobacco in the agricultural census of 1900. But there, in the newspapers, anecdotal references, especially to Brillhart. 1908, Charles Brillhart and Sons are harvesting and housing their tobacco, which is of a fine growth. They have been quite successful in tobacco raising for several years. The U.S. Department of Agriculture put out a report in the 1880s that talked about cigar tobacco in Maryland, and said that some of the best growing conditions were found along Pars Ridge, in the foothills of Pars Ridge, which runs from Mount Airy to Manchester. So there is some evidence of tobacco growth in the region, and as you drive through the area now, you might spot a field where the Amish are growing cigar tobacco on Broadbeck Road. Susan Bloom told me there's some in the Westminster area. It's a cash crop for the Amish today. William N. Gettier started his career opening up a factory with Charles Masonheimer in 1895. Masonheimer left to start his own factory on Westminster Street. Gettier had a factory until 1907. He had financial difficulties. There was a little bit of a national economic panic at the time. But his factory continued to operate, probably with him as manager of it. It was located where there was a gas station. The building was torn down for a gas station in the 1930s. But this is right beside where Maurer and Miller meets, the other side of the alley that goes back to Miller's store. This was the factory that Masonheimer and Gettier had, and then Gettier had. And then I traced the history of the factory in the History Journal. I won't go through all of the owners, but it went through a number of owners in the 1907 to 1917 period. This is the gas station. It looks better than that today. There's a hairdresser or salon in it now, but that's where the Gettier factory was. And the Sanborn maps, fire insurance maps, offer a little bit of a perspective on where the cigar factories were in Manchester. At this location, you can see the Gettier Cigar Company. They had an office and retail on the street side. In the back, they had a two-story factory. They did stripping of the tobacco on the first floor, rolling of cigars on the second floor, and then they had a storehouse for tobacco sort of behind along the alley there. Charles Masonheimer was in partnership with Gettier. He then went on his own. He built a new factory on Westminster Street, and he produced a lot of cigars in the time period 1897 to 1924. It was a major enterprise in Manchester, and he sold to Wertheimer Brothers in 1924, which we'll talk about briefly. But this is a photograph of the two-story Masonheimer cigar factory. In this photograph, there are women still working in the factory, probably 1890s. There are other photographs of his factory staff. As you get into the 1900s, they start replacing the hand rolling stations with rollers and mechanized equipment, and the staff turns to all men. I have this photograph, which shows in the background the Masonheimer cigar factory, probably around 1920, when it was enlarged to 3 stories. And the Sanborn map also gives you a pretty clear idea of how expansive the factory was as a 3-story structure. Masonheimer also built worker housing, and the houses that are right up against the alley at Westminster Street, Maiden Lane and Westminster Street, are little row houses. They're oddly shaped. One of the walls comes in at an angle, but this row was built by Masonheimer for housing the workers at the Masonheimer factory. Masonheimer lived on Main Street. He upgraded his house with new windows, a fancy porch, as the industry grew and he prospered. But he also had in the back of his house a barn, and that barn today still has the metal racks in it where he hung the tobacco to dry. So he was buying some tobacco from plants in the area, putting it in his own garage, hanging it on metal racks. The cigar tobacco was air cured. Over a period of 4 to 8 weeks, the tobacco leaves would become low in sugar and high in nicotine. But both the Gettier factory and Masonheimer end up selling to Wertheimer Brothers. Wertheimer Brothers was a nationally known cigar manufacturer in Baltimore. They bought up some of the local factories as the machine age of cigar making developed. And they had a national brand called El Dallo. Some of the photographs and articles about Manchester talk about El Dallo cigars. 1917, an upgrade. The El Dallo firm has put in a number of bunch machines and rollers, and they're putting in full-time from 6 a.m. to 8 to 10 p.m. They pay from $5 to $20 or more a week. The other factories, too, are at their busiest, so quite a large sum of money goes into the economy and the citizens of Manchester every week. So Wertheimer in Manchester sort of represents the age of consolidation, maybe like our local banks in the 1990s. They actually established a small operation in Manchester in 1915. They then bought Gettier in 1918, bought Masonheimer in 1922, and in a national publication, the Retail Tobacconists of 1922, they describe how Wertheimer has purchased the Masonheimer factory, and therefore Wertheimer's operating 2 factories in Manchester, as well as 3 factories in Pennsylvania at Dallastown, Windsor, and Delta. And here's a photograph of the El Dallo factory. You can see it's all men working the machinery at that time. For a while, Wertheimer called their operation in Manchester the Manchester Cigar Manufacturing Company. One of the items in the Manchester Historical Center collection is a tin cigar box for the Duke of Manchester. And inside the cover of the tin box, it says, Duke of Manchester Clear Havana Cigar. This little cigar is made of long stripped Havana filler, carefully selected and guaranteed to be very mild. The utmost care is exercised in making this little cigar, and when you examine it, you will recognize and appreciate its superior quality and workmanship. So Havana seed is the reference to tobacco grown locally, but based on a Havana seed. So they could call a cigar made in Manchester or American made a Havana cigar if the seed was based upon a tobacco variety that originated in Havana. So I'll run through quickly some of the other cigar makers that will touch upon some of our themes. I'll try to do just sort of a quick survey, but occasionally you get historical references like Slichter's, where he says there were 200 people in Manchester employed in the cigar industry. Actually, were many more. In this list, you see some of the big names, the early entrepreneurs, Lilly and Wareheim, the golden era, Gettier and Masonheimer. But there were many others. Here's 36 names. I think I could probably add about 5 or 10 more to this list. One of the interesting characters is Charles J.H. Ganter. He was a pharmacist. He opened a drugstore in 1878. The drugstore business was going well for him, but he jumped in the cigar game in 1892, and one of the business advertisements said that in 1892 he was making 15,000 cigars a month, sold in Western Maryland and Virginia. His brands were Ganter's Gold Seal, Ganter's Special, and Ganter's Cigars, spelled with an S. Ganter published a newspaper in Manchester, the Telephone Messenger. He was mayor for a term. He served in the Maryland House of Delegates and was postmaster whenever a Republican president was elected. The president appointed the local postmasters, so when there was a change in administration, the postmaster would change. Another big name in Manchester is Walter D. Hansen. He had a factory for many years where the Miller Gas Company building is located in Manchester, just one door south of the corner of York and Main Streets. He was a popular cigar manufacturer. There are a number of photographs of his operation, and the Manchester Historical Center has one of his cigar boxes, which he just used as 2 first initials, WD Cigars. The Hofackers were a prominent family in Alesia. There's an exhibit at the Historical Society now on bands of Carroll County, and the Hofackers were very prominent in the musical industry. I think a couple of them served at the Mexican border conflict, which Jay Graybeal wrote about in the Great War for Civilization. The Mexican border conflict, Company H from Westminster was sent down. They mainly had a grocery operation in Manchester, but several of the Hofackers were involved in the cigar industry as well around the period 1890 to 1910. And their grocery and their cigar operation was right at the corner. Some of Manchester residents will remember this as Malcolm Osler's drugstore and pharmacy. But this is the corner building that had the Samuel Lilly operation in it, the Nelson Wareheim cigar operation in it, and then Hofackers bought the building and had their grocery, dry goods, and cigar operation there. Just a couple doors south from that was Charles W. Motter, well known as the confectionery, bakery, and ice cream shop that he founded in 1865. He's listed in the Historical Society's 1892 directory as having a soda fountain, 2 ice cream parlors, water ices, wedding and fancy cakes, not listed as cigars at that time. But in the 1899 insurance book, he's shown as running a cigar factory as well. I guess the ice cream eaters like to have a cigar after they ate their ice cream. His factory was purchased by James Wagaman and then later operated as the Southern Cigar Factory. So there's a lot of fluidity in the cigar industry. A single cigar manufacturer might have 3 or 4 different locations as their operation grew over the history of their operation. The Manchester Historical Center has a piece of stationery of the Wagaman operation, and then that location was the Southern Cigar Factory. In the Carroll History Journal, I give the identification of the people in this Southern Cigar Factory photograph. And there are a lot of names that many people will recognize from Manchester. Southern Cigar Factory was located in this building, which once was the Keg Inn, Jimmy Lutz's bar, that then moved down the street. And the Historical Center collection has a cigar box from the Southern Cigar Company for their Royal Circle cigars. And more recently, somebody donated 2 advertising posts, painted metal, for the Southern Cigars Factory. Uncle Jake cigars, 2 for 5 cents, and the Royal Circle cigar. William Hoffman had a cigar factory on North Main Street for many years. 1900 census shows he's a 24-year-old cigar manufacturer. They were located at the house you might know as the Timberman House. John Timberman lived there until he died a couple years ago. And the interesting facet, I think, on this one, the reason I included it, is they lived in the house, and then they had the cigar factory and just a small appendage to the house. On the right-hand side on the porch, there's a setback, and there's a door where the retail store was, and the cigar factory was on the second floor of the house. I mentioned John Miller, coming in from Tank, Miller Station, and opening up a cigar factory. Bob Porterfield had a photograph in his collection that he used in several publications of the Miller Cigar Factory. It's a photograph taken by the photographer Wentz in 1890. I looked at the land records on this property. John Miller purchased the property in 1885 from George P. Miller. It's located right by the railroad tracks. And you can see a small cigar operation in a home. Those are the cigar workers standing beside the cellar entrance. Horatio Osler was a prominent figure in Manchester cigar making. He was the foreman for the Gettier and Wertheimer factories. He was sent to be a foreman at the Dallastown factory. He's in the newspapers a lot for his work in the cigar industry, and he's probably the last remaining cigar maker in town. He was making cigars into the 1940s. This is a family photograph of the Osler family, Horatio sitting in the front, and his son Malcolm, who ran the drugstore behind him. I had the opportunity to talk to Romaine Harper. I did an oral history interview with her when she was living in Lineborough. I have a wedding photograph because that was about the time she graduated from Manchester High School. Horatio Osler asked the principal, I need an office person. Do you have anybody who's pretty sharp? And she worked for Horatio Osler probably from 1941 to about 1948 or 49 when he closed his operation. The Manchester Historical Center has a Havana Fives cigar box for H.S. Osler. Osler lived in a brick house on right beside the Lutheran Church. I like this photograph because it's a group of bicyclers in a 4th of July parade in Manchester. You can see the brick house that was since been torn down for the Lutheran Church parking lot right in the center of the photograph. And you can see the Lutheran Church in its 1860s design before that was torn down and rebuilt in 1915. But Osler had the house there, and in the back he had a side building. That was his cigar factory when he started on his own. And then he built a building on Maiden Lane, which later became the sewing factory. But that was Osler's last location, right behind the Dutch Corner and Manchester Auto Parts. There are 2 things that aren't in the history journal that I thought I'd talk about briefly that was interesting as the cigar industry developed. And one was whether you had a union shop or a non-union shop. If you look at the national history of the labor movement, the big union movement began with cigar makers in New York City. Samuel Gompers was a cigar maker. And so as you got into the 1900s, several of the cigar makers in Manchester decided they wanted union shops. Robert M. Schauer is one of them. I mentioned him. He married one of the Wareheim daughters. He opened up a cigar manufactory, and he wanted people to know they were union-made cigars, so he had it very proudly displayed on his letterhead. There's a reference in the Democratic Advocate of 1902. Abkin and Ament, proprietors of the Union Cigar Factory, dissolved their co-partnership. Sam Abkin purchased the interest of Ament and will continue to run the factory as a union shop. Mr. Ament has been talking of running a non-union shop, but has not yet fully determined his intentions. So you have a national movement of unions, and you have the community of Manchester determining whether they wanted to have a union versus a non-union shop. The other interesting development was sort of federal regulation catching up to Manchester. In the Manchester Historical Center collection is a booking horse. And the booking horse was a wooden circular surface, and you would drape the tobacco leaf over that and with a knife devein the leaf. You would cut the veins out of the leaf, and that's called tobacco stripping. You didn't want the veins in the final product. And it was frequently done at home in the evenings. Well, in 1921, a federal regulator visited probably the Hoffman factory where the factory was in the home. It appears it has been the law during all these years, and tons of tobacco has been taken to homes where it was stripped and returned to the factories and made into cigars that were box stamped and sold according to the requirements of the revenue laws. Everything worked smoothly during this long period until last month when a special inspector came here examining the books and products of factories. In his visit, he got into the wrong door of a double house and found the occupants in the home stripping tobacco when the factory was in the other part of the house. He at once wanted to know how it was that they were stripping, and by their information found out that all the factories were having their stripping done in the homes of a number of persons, and they've been doing it for years. He ordered it stopped at once. So this was a big controversy in 1921. Just the nature of the business, people would take the tobacco home at night, they would strip it at home. Of course, they didn't have television, didn't have radio. They sat by the candlelight, stripped the tobacco, brought it in the next day. Somehow the federal regulators didn't catch on until 1921, and they shut it down. Now, George Loringer, who had a factory at the time, he's listed as a cigar maker at age 18 in 1910. His draft registration, 1917, he was superintendent in Dallastown for Wertheimer, but then he came home to open up his own factory, and he couldn't stand for the federal regulators. So there's an article where he goes to Washington, D.C. to meet with his congressman. He told his congressman how unfair it was for these federal regulations to I see George Maurer smiling about the federal regulators on meat processing. George Loringer had a very nice visit with his congressman, but nothing happened. All the factories decided to bring the stripping inside the factory, and people couldn't do their stripping at home anymore, tobacco stripping at home anymore. And this is a cigar band. It's not a good photograph, but it was on eBay at one time, and I didn't outbid the person on it. But there's a cigar band, George J. Luringer, GJL, Manchester, Maryland. So I'll conclude with a shout out to the Manchester Historical Center. They are open the first Sunday and third Saturday of the month. They have excellent resources on the cigar industry. A number of the photographs that I included in this presentation are from their collection. They also have a display. Belva Lamont brought it to the Historical Society last fall for a few weeks. They have excellent artifacts from the cigar making industry. If you have a chance to stop by there, you can see some of the tools of the trade. 9 years ago, I went through a lot of the artifacts and the tools of the trade. This time I thought I'd just sort of catch you up on what we've learned about the cigar makers, their interactions with Pennsylvania, with Baltimore, a little bit about their personalities, their involvement in the community, and that brings us back to this great interior photograph of the cigar industry of Maryland. Thank you very much.
Tobacco in this area, because I was really surprised to go up to Bear Run to a farm owned by the Stoltzfus family, and they had a tremendous amount of tobacco growing. And I was really surprised to see it. And they are storing it in what appears to be like makeshift greenhouse buildings out there on Bear Run Road. And I did wonder what they were using it for. So it sounds like it probably is cigars, huh?
So in the mid-1800s, there were two major areas for cigar tobacco growth. One was Connecticut, and that Connecticut growth sort of migrated through New York into Ohio, and there were cigar factories that followed that in the late 1800s. Another center was Lancaster, York, Pennsylvania, and Lancaster, York continues to be a major cigar tobacco growth area. Obviously, with tobacco buyouts, many farmers took tobacco buyouts from Pennsylvania and from Maryland. However, the Amish, not trusting the government, did not take tobacco buyouts, and they have a monopoly on the market right now, and it's a very productive cash crop for them. Okay.
Have we come across any marketing? We think about, cigars being sort of now male recreation, but was the production maybe in line with marketing to everybody? Is this, and I'm assuming this is kind of pre-cigarette era. Have you come across anything related?
Jason asked about marketing and specifically marketing to women or just general marketing. 9 years ago, I started the presentation with the photograph that Bob Porterfield had of 20-somethings on the porch, women and men all smoking cigars. So it wasn't just a male avocation. The history of tobacco, obviously very much a part of Maryland's history. Maryland thrived on tobacco for export, and that tobacco was mostly smoked in pipes or snuff. By the Civil War, cigars became the popular consumption vehicle for tobacco. Both men and women smoked cigars. C.V. Wance of Westminster had great marketing in Westminster, the Yellow Cigar Store. I'm sure he sold to both genders. And if you look at the newspapers, Democratic Advocate, American Sentinel, eventually the Carroll County Times in 1910, They're frequently period advertising for cigars. George Loringer has advertisements in the Westminster newspapers, and they follow the same pattern of Victorian era cigar, basic advertising, same style and scheme. I didn't include any in this presentation, but they were using the local newspapers to promote their product.
Bill?
Okay. I have two questions. One is you mentioned that the workforce was predominantly women early on and then became predominantly male. What accounts for that transition? What's going on?
First question was about the transition from women to men in the cigar factories. So I think the early entrepreneurs didn't need a lot of capital. Women were generally not in the workforce, so they were generally available. And they could, on a second floor, stick up 10 workstations just like this and have the women roll the cigars and produce 12,000, 40,000 a month. And so I think that initial period from 1870 to about 1900, it's hand labor. One of the cigar history articles say it was quality labor. It would take about a year to train somebody to roll a good cigar. But you reach 1900 and the factories are producing much higher quantities of cigars. And they're using bunching machines and roller machines. So I think the all-male workforce for the industry comes about because of the mechanization of the industry.
The other question was regarding the regulatory system of the time. It was federal regulation, this was workforce regulation, this is part of the rest.
So we talk about that in the History Journal, and I didn't go over it here. Frank Badovic took a great interest in the federal regulation. So we have a page on federal regulation in the handout that's in the hallway. But alcohol, tobacco, and firearms still goes back into the 1800s. Tobacco was highly regulated because it was highly taxed. And the tax revenue supported government operations, including wars. And so initially, the cigars were made, they were put in a hogshead barrel, put on the train in Greenmount, shipped to Baltimore. But then the government changed the regulations, and every cigar had to be boxed, and there had to be a revenue stamp on each box to show that the taxes were paid. And then there were even regulations about selling individual cigars from a box. And so it was a highly regulated industry from the get-go. Manchester stayed under the radar screen on the stripping issue until 1921.
The stripping issue is part of the process, but that has to be done by a manufacturer, not in a residential structure. Is that?
Well, the federal regulators believed that there could be hanky-panky going on with tobacco, people, rolling cigars themselves and not paying the federal tax on it. So they wanted all operations within the factory. You couldn't have a home cottage industry of stripping the tobacco.
We have a question here.
Okay.
Joe, what about women going to work in sewing factories? I was thinking that perhaps as they left tobacco factories, that was the beginning of growth of women in sewing factories across Carroll County and probably the United States.
So Mimi brought up the issue of sewing factories. In fact, the Horatio Osler building that was built as a cigar factory then became a sewing factory. Westminster, Hampstead, and Manchester, Tawnytown all had sort of transitioned into sewing factory economies in the early 1900s. And there you would have the men in charge of the machinery. The De Palmer family in Manchester was in Little Italy in Baltimore working in sewing factories, and they were sent to Manchester so that the men could work on the sewing machines. Mostly the employees were women working in the sewing factories. There was a Manchester pants factory. Hampstead had a pants factory. And that was a primary women workforce, but the men handled all the mechanical aspects of it. And the De Palmers never left Manchester, so I went to school with them. But they remain because as a vestige of the machinery of the sewing factory. Yep.
Anyone else? Oh, right here, Ryan.
Did you learn anything about the health of the employees or of the servers?
Diana asked if I learned anything about the health of the employees. So in Manchester, I think the conditions were very different from Baltimore City and New York, where workers were put in tenements with very poor living conditions, and the health of the employees was a real concern. I don't think we had factory conditions like the big cities had, and the union movement was because of the poor conditions, and there are many historical newspaper articles about how poor the conditions were for factory workers in urban areas. There were some newspaper references to the influenza coming through in 1918, and cigar factories having to shut down because of the influenza. But I did not find anything regarding individual health working with the tobacco or poor work conditions for the employees. I think that's one of the advantages Manchester had in having basically smaller operations, not the 5-story cigar factories, and everybody knowing everybody else. I think they wouldn't put up with poor conditions for the people that they were living next to or going to church with, or that their son or daughter had married. It was a very tight community. They socialized a lot together. The hotels were very busy with boarders of workers and salesmen and that type of thing. And everybody knew each other. So Manchester did not have the egregious work conditions that you read about in that period of history in the urban factories.
Joe, thank you very, very
Thank you.
much.